Pam Bondi walked into that courtroom knowing exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a moment charged with tension, with power dynamics playing out in real time. The air was thick with the unspoken reality that her voice, her presence, her willingness to speak boldly was seen as a threat. And so, in an effort that felt less like justice and more like control, a staggering $50,000 fine was thrown at her. Not because she broke the law, not because she endangered anyone, but because she dared to speak in a way that disrupted the carefully managed narrative. This wasn't about order in the courtroom. It wasn't about protecting the process. It was a show of force, a warning shot disguised as a fine, a message that said, sit down, be quiet, or pay the price. When someone is hit with a threat like that, it's not just money on the line. It's a warning to others watching. Look what happens when you step out of line. The fine was symbolic, more than financial. It was meant to chill the room, to send the message loud and clear that free speech only applies when it's convenient, for the ones in power. Pam Bondi's response to this threat didn't come with panic or fear. She stood steady, fully aware of what this moment represented. She understood that what was happening wasn't just an attack on her personally. It was an attempt to set a precedent. If they could silence her with a fine, who else might they silence next? This is the kind of moment where most people would feel the walls closing in. The pressure to comply, to apologize, to backpedal, it's overwhelming by design. It's a tactic used not just in courtrooms, but in politics, in media, in every corner where real truth poses a risk. And yet, the attempt to muzzle her had the opposite effect. It didn't create submission. It ignited resolve. When power tries to flex like that, it reveals its weakness. It shows that it's not confident in its own foundation. If what she said truly held no merit, why go to such great lengths to silence her? The fine wasn't a sign of strength. It was a flashing signal of fear. This isn't new. We've seen this playbook before. Whether it's social censorship, media takedowns, or courtroom penalties, it's always dressed up in policy and process, but the intent is crystal clear. Keep the bold ones quiet. Punish the ones who refuse to play along, and what they didn't count on was her refusing to fold. They expected hesitation, perhaps regret. What they got was defiance, calm, measured, and unshakable. There's a difference between breaking rules and challenging injustice, and that's the line that gets blurred deliberately when people in power feel threatened. Throwing a $50,000 fine into the mix was a calculated move. It wasn't spontaneous. It was strategic. The kind of action meant to send ripples far beyond the courtroom walls. It wasn't just meant for her ears, it was meant for the public. It was meant for anyone watching who might think of standing up next. But here's the problem with that approach. When you go too far trying to suppress someone, you often end up spotlighting them instead. Instead of making her an example of what happens when you speak out, they accidentally made her an example of how to resist. It backfired. In trying to shut her down, they gave her an even bigger platform. They made it about more than her words. They made it about the right to speak them without fear. That $50,000 figure wasn't just punitive. It was outrageous by design. It was so over the top, so disproportionate, that it stripped away any illusion of fairness. It revealed what the real agenda was. Not protecting the dignity of the court, not maintaining order, but silencing dissent. And when the mask slips like that, people start paying attention in a different way. They start asking deeper questions. They start wondering who's really calling the shots and why they're so scared of people like her speaking up. In that moment, she became more than a participant in a courtroom. She became a symbol of resistance to arbitrary power, not because she shouted, not because she disrupted, but because she didn't retreat. She didn't buckle under pressure. And that, more than any words she said, is what shook the room. There's a kind of silence that falls right before someone decides to push back. It's not fear. It's calculation. It's the pause before a deliberate move, the breath before the strike. When that $50,000 fine was thrown down like a gauntlet, it wasn't just about money. It was a challenge, an assertion of authority, a hope, perhaps, that the weight of that number would be enough to make her step back, apologize, fold. But that's not what happened. In a matter of seconds, the dynamic shifted entirely. Not because she yelled or flailed, but because she stood her ground with absolute clarity and confidence. There are moments in public life where everything hangs in the balance, where one response can define the entire situation. Most people, facing the threat of a hefty fine and a courtroom stacked against them, might retreat or deflect. They might change their tone, play it safe, comply just enough to avoid further damage. That's what was expected. But instead of doing what was expected, she chose a different path, one that instantly flipped the power in the room. She didn't react with outrage. She didn't get emotional or defensive. She didn't have to. Her response was controlled, sharp, and immediate. And that's what made it so powerful. Because in that moment, she wasn't just defending herself, she was exposing the entire game. She turned what was meant to be a punishment into a spotlight. She made it impossible to ignore the imbalance, the absurdity, the desperation behind the attempt to shut her down. The room may have been silent, but the message was deafening. What makes a response like that land with such impact isn't just the content of what's said. It's the timing, the poise, the refusal to be intimidated. That kind of composure doesn't come from ego. It comes from knowing exactly who you are, what you stand for, and why you're not afraid. The courtroom was supposed to be a place where the narrative was controlled, where the rules favored the enforcers. But in that moment, she cracked through the illusion and revealed something much more raw and honest. Fear doesn't belong to the truth teller. It belongs to the ones trying to stop the truth from getting out. People watching from the outside may have seen it as a small gesture, a few words exchanged in a legal setting. But anyone paying attention understood the weight of what happened. She didn't just defend her right to speak, she claimed it unapologetically. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask for sympathy. She simply said what needed to be said, and in doing so, reclaimed the space that was being taken from her. The beauty of a moment like that is that it can't be undone. Once the truth is spoken with that kind of courage, it lives in the air. It lingers in the minds of everyone who witnessed it, and no amount of fines or threats or procedural tactics can erase it. In fact, those very tactics become the proof that something is being hidden, something is being controlled, something is being feared. Her response peeled back that curtain in real time. It's not often you see someone reverse the direction of power with a single moment of clarity. But that's what happened. The attempt to silence her became a stage for defiance. Not the chaotic kind, not the kind fueled by rage, but the kind that's deeply rooted in principle. The kind that doesn't have to shout to be heard. That quiet strength, that unshakable presence, it's what rattled the room more than any outburst ever could. There's also something deeply human about it. Watching someone stand up under pressure, knowing full well what's at stake, and still choosing not to back down, it hits differently. It inspires. It reminds people that even when the odds are stacked, there's still power in truth, especially when it's delivered without fear. That's why the tables turn so fast. Because in a world where so many stay silent just to stay safe, someone who refuses to be silenced becomes impossible to ignore. She didn't need theatrics or drama. She needed only a few seconds, the strength of her voice and the certainty of her conviction. And with that, the entire situation changed. What began as a tactic to suppress her message turned into a moment of undeniable exposure. The curtain was pulled back, the imbalance revealed, and the moment someone is punished not for what they did, but for what they dared to say, it becomes clear that the system isn't functioning to protect justice. It's functioning to protect itself. What happened in that courtroom wasn't a fair response to disorder or misconduct. It was a carefully executed tactic meant to send a message: don't challenge the narrative. But instead of working as intended, it did something else entirely. It exposed the silencing tactics that often go unseen. It pulled the curtain back on how authority sometimes masks fear with force, and how control is often maintained not through dialogue but through suppression. Silencing doesn't always come in the form of censorship in the media or sweeping bans on speech. Sometimes it wears the robe of respectability. It comes through fines, threats, subtle but unmistakable punishments that are supposed to keep dissent in check. The $50,000 fine wasn't random. It was strategic. It was there to intimidate, to warn, to discourage not just one person, but everyone watching. It was meant to demonstrate that stepping out of line would come with consequences. But when that strategy is pushed too far, it stops being subtle. It becomes obvious even to those who once believed the system was neutral. That's what made this moment so revealing. People watching weren't just witnessing a legal disagreement. They were witnessing the machinery of control in action. The words spoken didn't cause chaos. They caused discomfort to those in power. And discomfort, when exposed under bright lights, often leads to retaliation disguised as order. But the truth has a funny way of shining through, even when pressure is applied. Especially when pressure is applied. There's always a risk when someone speaks truth to power, but there's an even greater risk for the power that feels it must respond with suppression. Because once people see that voices are being silenced, not for causing harm, but for threatening a controlled narrative, they begin to question the entire structure. Why the overreaction? Why the punishment? Why the urgency to shut someone down so forcefully? These questions don't go away quietly. They linger, they multiply, and they lead to something the system never wants: scrutiny. What became crystal clear in that courtroom wasn't just the unfairness of the fine. It was the fear behind it. The fine itself was like a flare going off in the dark, revealing that the goal wasn't balance. It was submission. Not accountability, but obedience. And when the response to speech is punishment, it tells the public exactly what kind of speech is feared. Not hate, not misinformation, but truth that challenges the dominant framework. Truth that encourages people to think for themselves, to look closer, to ask questions they're not supposed to ask. That's the power of exposure. 1 minute, the room is cloaked in the illusion of impartiality. The next, the mask slips, and you see the gears turning. You see the reflex to control, and once people recognize that, it can't be unseen. A fine that was meant to silence instead became a loudspeaker. A punishment meant to discourage instead became a catalyst for awareness. People don't rally around polished speeches or rehearsed performances. They rally around moments that feel real, raw, and unfiltered. And that's what they saw. Not just someone being punished, but someone being targeted for being inconvenient to the narrative. That changes things. It shifts perspectives. It forces observers to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that not all institutions act in good faith. Some act to preserve their image, their control, their grip on the story. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one voice being threatened. It was about all the voices that could be next. It was about drawing a line in the sand and saying, "Step over this and you'll pay." But the irony is, when the system reacts so harshly, it validates the very concerns being raised. It proves that the voice they tried to quiet was onto something real. Otherwise, why go to such lengths? Once that realization clicks, the dynamic changes. People start to see the pattern. They see how often bold voices are labeled dangerous, disruptive, or out of line, when really, they're just unafraid. And when the tactics to suppress them become clear, the suppression loses its power. It doesn't scare people into silence. It wakes them up. It makes them look closer. It makes them listen harder. Because now they know the difference between chaos and challenge, between disruption and truth. The moment she stood her ground, something shifted, not just in the courtroom, but beyond it. People watching weren't just witnessing a legal confrontation. They were watching a live demonstration of what it means to stand in the face of pressure without blinking. It wasn't just about defending her right to speak. It was about showing in real time that power doesn't always flow from titles or positions. Sometimes it flows from clarity, from conviction, from someone who refuses to bow. And when people saw that unfold, something sparked. At first, it might have seemed like just another clash between authority and a strong personality, something to be brushed off or forgotten. But it wasn't. Because what happened in those seconds, when she refused to be silenced, when she calmly pushed back against the attempt to fine her into submission, resonated far beyond that moment. It echoed with people who have felt their own voices smothered in other ways, in other places. It reminded them that speaking up still matters, that it still carries weight, and that someone pushing back against a seemingly untouchable institution can still make a difference. There was something undeniable about the way it unfolded. There were no theatrics, no grand gestures, just a clear refusal to submit to something unjust. And that's what made it so compelling. Because when power expects fear and gets fearlessness instead, it doesn't know what to do. That's when the cracks start to show. That's when the public starts to see not just what's happening in front of them, but what it really means underneath. It wasn't about rebellion, it was about integrity. And integrity, when witnessed unfiltered, has a way of pulling people in. She didn't walk into that room with an army behind her. She didn't have the backing of media spin or a flood of support waiting in the wings. But by the time she walked out, everything had changed. Not because the fine disappeared or the opposition backed down, but because people watching saw something that felt increasingly rare, someone willing to lose something in order to stand for something. That kind of courage doesn't fade, it sticks, it grows, it becomes fuel for others. You could see it in the way people responded afterward. There was a kind of energy that wasn't there before, not just admiration, but alignment. People didn't just applaud, they connected. They saw their own struggles, their own moments of being told to sit down or be quiet, reflected in what she faced. And the fact that she didn't fold made them feel like maybe they didn't have to either. That's how momentum begins, not with a mass movement or a viral campaign, but with one person drawing a line and refusing to step back from it. There's something incredibly powerful about someone who knows the cost of resistance and chooses it anyway. That kind of choice has ripple effects. It challenges others to reassess their own limits, their own silence, their own fear. The rallying that followed wasn't manufactured. It wasn't organized. It was organic, real people responding to something authentic. And that authenticity can't be bought, staged, or suppressed. It lives in the minds of those who witness it, and it takes root. The shift wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. People started talking, questioning, pushing back. Conversations that had once felt too risky suddenly seemed necessary. Doubts that had been quietly forming began to take shape out loud. And through it all, her example stood as proof that one voice, unshaken, could tilt the balance. That the loudest power in the room wasn't the one with the authority to fine, it was the one with the courage to face that fine and keep speaking anyway. In a world where it often feels like power has the final word, watching someone interrupt that assumption, even for a moment, has a seismic impact. It resets expectations. It reminds people that courage isn't a myth. It's real. It's visible. And when it shows up at the right time, in the right place, it doesn't just protect the speaker, it empowers the listeners. That's how movements start, quietly, in a room not built for them. But once they start, they're very hard to stop. What unfolded in that courtroom was more than just a legal skirmish. It was a defining moment that revealed the fragile line between power and principle. When someone stands alone and chooses truth over comfort, it sends a ripple effect that cannot be contained. That's what made this moment unforgettable. It wasn't just about the fine, the pressure, or the institution trying to maintain control. It was about what happens when one person decides that fear will not dictate their words, their actions, or their integrity. People often underestimate how quickly the tide can turn. They forget that most revolutions don't begin with noise. They begin with clarity. One person saying no to a system designed to keep everyone saying yes. That's why the reaction was so visceral, so immediate. It didn't take a political campaign, a marketing strategy, or a team of strategists to make an impact. It took one individual standing firm in the face of a threat that was supposed to crush her and instead became the moment that defined her. Strength. And people were watching. They always are. Not just in the room, but across the country, across the platforms, across the conversations that never make headlines. They watched how she responded to pressure. They watched how she didn't flinch. And in that they found permission. Permission to question, to challenge, to rethink their own silence. Because courage is contagious. It spreads in quiet ways, igniting something deep inside people who have felt cornered, muted, or powerless. It doesn't take long for that kind of spark to catch fire. That's the legacy of this kind of moment. Not that one person stood up, but that she showed others they could too. It's not just about resisting a fine or challenging authority, it's about reminding people that speaking truth doesn't always come wrapped in comfort. Sometimes it comes with consequences. But when those consequences are met with resolve, they lose their grip. They stop being threats and start becoming proof that the truth has weight. In the end, the attempt to silence her didn't work. In fact, it did the opposite. It revealed more than it concealed. It proved that the system doesn't always serve justice. It sometimes serves itself. And when that truth comes to light, when it's spoken without apology or fear, it doesn't just resonate, it sticks. It lingers in every conversation that follows. And long after the courtroom lights go out, that moment lives on in the minds of the people it reached. What she did wasn't loud. It wasn't reckless. It was deliberate, powerful, and unshakably real. And that's what makes it matter. Because in a world constantly trying to silence the inconvenient, sometimes the most revolutionary thing a person can do is simply refuse to be quiet.